This podcast talks candidly and openly about issues of male sexual violence. A full list of topics can be found in the episode description. Hello and welcome to Beyond the Silence, the official podcast of We Are Survivors. Welcome back for our first episode of Season 2. Really glad you could join us. Hopefully you've seen some of Season 1. I'll forgive you if you haven't. But at the very least, make sure you keep an eye out for our 16th anniversary special. That's out on all of our socials and on the medium that you're watching this on right now. It's a two-parter where we discuss the history of the organisation with some familiar faces and some famous guests. My name is George. I'm your host for this podcast. I'm also a member of our community development team here at We Are Survivors. And I'm very excited to introduce my two guests for today, Kaelin and Duncan, who are members of our Independent Sexual Violence Advisory Service, also known as the ISVAs, but I won't spoil any more than that because they'll introduce it much better themselves. In terms of the episode, you can find timestamps in the description, but just to lay things out for you, we'll begin with a general interview and understanding, conversations and discussions about what ISVAs do, what you might expect if you were reporting to court, and what that process really looks like. We're then going to blend very smoothly and seamlessly into our news and research section, focusing on two pieces of research that surround the role of jurors and also some of the myths and difficulties that people face in their reporting process that may cause them to pull out of the process a little earlier, or indeed why they report and see things through in the first place. Finally, then, we're going to have an activity, or rather services spotlight for today, where we'll talk about the role of the Nightingale suite that we are sat in as I speak to you currently. And then we will close out with letters, pulling a voice from a survivor within the research to discuss that a little bit further. We do hope you join us for the entire episode, but you can jump through as needed. Now, if you're sitting comfortably, let's begin. So with that out of the way, gentlemen, who would like to tell me what an Independent Sexual Violence Advisor, or ISVA, actually is?
I'm happy to take this one. So Independent Sexual Violence Advisors, I think we have sort of two main roles.
Yeah.
The first is all about criminal justice support. That's sort of demystifying what can be quite a sort of lofty process.
Yeah, it's intimidating to even sort of comprehend what it entails, right? Yeah.
And it's a long process, and having that point of contact both with the survivor and the police, I think, sort of brings people together. Mm-hmm. As I said, demystifies the process. And also there are points that are really challenging, I think, for survivors to navigate.
Yeah.
Going to trial itself, doing video interviews, they can be quite intense points in the process, and I think having someone there to sort of offer therapeutic support as well as practical support.
Yeah, you're the ride or die from report to court the whole way, and having that kind of continuity. And you were saying about that second point as well, Duncan, and that's about the sort of more wider advocacy role?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of the work we kind of cover is about, not from a therapeutic point of view necessarily, but around the stabilisation of that client.
Okay,
so for example, if they come to us, have always had this trauma, this experience happen, that in itself is really difficult, but they also might have loads of other things going on in their lives.
Yeah.
They might have housing issues, health issues, need engagement from other services. So that's where we'd kind of step in and effectively advocate on their behalf. So find out what's going on. I think would do that.
I think it's something about if we look at the average time for a male survivor to disclose in general, we're looking at about 20 years. It seems like a lot of survivors who are going into the court process or the police process often sort of inadvertently start that reporting process. Maybe they find out that someone else they know is involved and they want to protect someone, or they feel like their window for justice, maybe because the age of the perpetrator is closing and it's their time to share. And so it seems like some of our survivors would be in a position where either they've got family to worry about in the background, maybe they're a little bit older, they've got health concerns. You know, no one's life is defined by survivorship. So your role would flow into a lot of different things.
Yeah.
And I think these things all sort of tend to come at one time, as you're sort of alluding to.
Yeah.
I think sometimes someone's sought support from a therapist service, and that therapist service is disclosed because that's their policy.
Right,
and then suddenly they're getting emotional support for the first time. Now they're in the criminal justice process. And as I said, it can all come on very quickly. So having someone right from the off to sort of take things one step at a time look at sort of all the support that they're getting and make sure that it's not too overwhelming, that there's not too many people involved, and sort of really streamline the process, I think is quite important.
100%. I'm about to ask you a few questions about that process, about what you might expect when you report, but that's certainly something I'm aware of. Whenever I see a client who's just come into our service or just started with ISVA, I often pull back on the kind of check-in calls or the engagement I do. I leave that mostly to your team, because I know that you're in a better position to just be that one voice in the air for a little bit of time. Whereas normally with survivors, I like multiple points of contact. So if someone's off, it's a bit better. But when someone's going into that criminal process, especially at the very, very start, I pull back entirely because it's just so overwhelming. Yeah. If I reported tomorrow to the police, or if I disclosed to someone on the team that I was considering reporting, what would that kind of process look like? How does that sort of begin in terms of their engagement with the ISVA service?
So again, it would depend on kind of what the circumstances would be. But if for example they made it a choice themselves to go and report, so they said, I'm going to go to the police station or ring 101, then what we'd hope for there is any kind of contact with the police, they'd give details of ourselves or our service. Some people will self-refer, they'll Google and obviously find us that way, or maybe speak to friends or family. But I guess in terms of people who are already within the service who then decide to report, that would look like basically like that team member then approaching us as ISVAs and saying, we've got this person, obviously with permission, and they're thinking about this, what can we do? And then we'd look at picking them up, wouldn't we, in terms of making contact, really quickly. There's not really a waiting time.
Yeah, that's so. If there's sort of obviously two ways you can report to the police, as Duncan said, you can go and do that yourself. Yeah. But some people who've been in the service, it might have been something they were thinking about for a while. So in that case, we'd probably sit down with them, sort of make the report with them, guide them through sort of what quite vague information the police are going to need at the early stages. And sort of go from there. Would be sort of the next stages would be getting a crime reference number, getting a police officer, and sort of waiting for them to make contact.
Okay, and there's obviously often barriers about historic distrust with the police with some survivors. If they feel like their life's gone off on a difficult trajectory, they may have their own issues with the police in the past, or some survivors as well, because of their experiences or because of just what they've been through in their own lives, may struggle to feel like they'd be believed, or that justice is really out there for them. So it feels like there's a lot of coaching and information sharing in those early stages, and then empowering the survivor to make their own choice. You'd never push someone to report?
No, not at all. So I think, I can't remember if it's Kaelin yourself mentioned before about kind of the report to court. I generally see it as like before court, after court journey, because some of the conversations we'll have with the clients who come into the service, some of the survivors we speak to, will literally be a conversation. There'll be no pressure. It'll be like, what have you done so far? What have you thought about? What are your own ideas about what's involved in the process? You can do a bit of myth busting perhaps. And give them the information so then they can make that informed choice. So rather than it being, you've told us now we need to report, it's like, what do you want to do? And keep that survivor at the forefront of that journey still.
So what are those initial considerations? So on the survivor's side, how kind of long would they be waiting for the process? What's sort of the average amount of time there? But also on your side, when you're going through those early stages of getting the reports done, what kind of role do you play in terms of facilitating contact or being a kind of a go-between? I understand I've asked sort of two questions there. Let's start with one. How kind of long would you be waiting for if you reported now?
And until you get to court?
Yeah.
I mean, how long is a piece of string? A little bit.
Right.
I would say, the investigation is probably the time that can be the most variable. And there's there's a manner of different ways to investigate and a manner of different teams that will be investigating. So it's the investigation that's probably the most variable. I think at the moment, if you reported today, a safe estimate would probably be about 5 years to be in court, which is far too long.
That's where all the advocacy side of things comes in, the holding the hand, the support, the continuity and the contact.
And I think when you made that report, it would be so easy in that sort of feeling of emotional turmoil to feel that you'd been forgotten if someone hadn't contacted you. Having a point of contact there throughout the process that you're going to get to know quite well.
Yeah.
Being able to check in if you haven't had an update, being able to check in at each of the sort of harder stages of the process is so key.
So then when you're talking about those harder stages, are we talking about the initial disclosure and then looking at maybe the ABE, the video interview?
Yeah, absolutely. I think they definitely feature in as some of the more difficult parts of the process. But I think one of the ones I come across quite a lot is it's actually not a part of the process and it's not a named thing. It's the waiting.
Yes.
So I think it's quite interesting when people come into the service and they speak to us and we kind of say, look, we'll be with you throughout that journey. It's quite a unique role, the ISVA, because I don't know many others of any kind that kind of stick with someone for that amount of time.
It's the whole journey, yeah.
So when you kind of say, I'll be with you to kind of to the end, wherever that may turn up, you know, if it is, for example, going to court, then you could be with someone for, you know, potentially half a decade.
You're going to really get to know someone during that time and know their needs, and their story.
Absolutely.
To an extent, yeah.
Yeah. And I think in terms of, again, the waiting times, the periods, like when we kind of give what we call our ISVA info session.
Yeah.
And we explain about kind of rough timelines that we can kind of stick to. I normally explain it's like once you've done your report and you've done your video interview, you're likely to find it's a bit of radio silence for a bit.
Sure.
And that's okay, that's normal. But I won't be radio silent. I will work with you to find out what you need in that time period.
So when the survivor's in that period where they've gone through those difficult stages and they're waiting, and it's not the radio silence because they've got that contact with you. Let's step back over to the other side, that other sort of question I was asking. What kind of relationship are you going to be having with police and other services during that time? What does that look like? So are you standing between them and the survivor? Are you facilitating contact, or is it more of a case of working directly with these services?
I think it can be a real mix.
Yeah.
So I guess in theory, all criminal justice services would work in unison and streamlined and very smoothly. I'm
hearing the word in theory here. It feels like it's doing a lot of work.
I think it does happen. It can happen. I've certainly had experience of it happening. And when it does, it's fantastic. Yeah. Mainly for the survivor. But also even as practitioners, as professionals, it's really good. I think interesting what you said in terms of kind of, you know, where you stand in between. Sometimes, so we can be like a single point of contact with the police. So all contact with them will come through us. There's kind of, I guess, oddments between where the police will have to directly speak to the client, to the survivor, because it'd be like the interview where we can't be present in interview.
Right, but it's not going to be them cold calling. It'll be them arranging appointments through you. So I think that's the important.
Come through us and arrange, absolutely.
I think I always say to clients that the ISVA role, as you say, is a really flexible one.
Yeah.
And we're going to be working together long enough that we can sort of figure out what you want the ISVA role to look like.
Yes.
If that's you don't really want any contact from the police or minimal contact with the police, I can do the brunt of that for you. If you're really happy talking to the police and you like the sort of reminder that it's being investigated, if you like the contact, if you like the feeling that, you know, I've been silent for so long and I'm getting this done, then I'll just be a bit of a sort of a point of contact for you to answer any questions.
Yeah.
It's so flexible, and I think even my role looks really different client to client.
Yeah, I think it's really important.
Yeah, so in terms of our engagement with the police, it can be as much as talking exclusively to the police for the client, or it can be as little as we'll just check in and get some clarity on something they've said to the client a couple of weeks ago.
Sure.
So it's really variable, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think in those occasions, like you spoke of, the latter one, that'd be more our check-ins with the client would be around more maybe the practical steps advocacy than the actual criminal justice, because that bit's being satisfied, if you will, by the officer. And for me, it's all about giving that survivor ownership over their narrative as much as possible as well.
Yeah.
So not for me to step in as an ISVA and say, look, I'm the expert here, you don't know what you're talking about, because a lot of survivors will already had that in lives through lots of different experiences.
Yeah.
So try and kind of mitigate as much as possible and give them that kind of that control back as much
Yeah,
as possible.
I think that's a really, really crucial word.
Yeah.
It can feel like justice is a process that's happening to someone, not for someone. And certainly when we talk a little bit later about the court experience, I think that comes into it a bit more. Do you ever feel like you have to play an educational role? How would you say your experiences are in terms of with the police on understanding how best to support survivors? Do you often feel like you have to step and say, this is not how to do it in order to help my client, or is it a bit of a mixed experience?
I'd say it's probably a mix, wouldn't you?
Yeah. I think we definitely have an element of being an educational role.
Yeah.
Both for the clients who might not
I'm getting an
understand
appreciation of
elements,
that. Yeah.
but also, of course, there are times when the police might not follow best practice, and there is an element of our role, sort of being advocates.
Yeah, definitely.
Of going, like, that doesn't sort of meet the expectations of this process.
Yeah.
That sort of, we have our victims code, and we always sort of try and follow that and ensure that the police are following that as well. So we do try and ensure that code is met, sort of as educationally as possible, I suppose.
Yeah, it should always be on the table, and you're there to point to it.
Yeah, exactly.
Police work with a wide range of cases. There are certain times when they're going to be interviewing people where the expectations and standards and need for care might be a lot lower, but you're experts in survivors and you're there to empower survivors' voices. So just making sure that there's little reminders of maybe don't talk to my client in that way, or don't call them at this time, or
exactly. And as you say, we're working with these guys for so long.
Yeah,
we know how they want to be contacted.
Yes. Yeah.
We know sort of what is gonna be triggering or re-traumatizing for them.
Yeah.
And trying to ensure that all services are working at a standard that will avoid that is a key part of our role, I think.
Yeah. No, absolutely. So we've talked a little bit about ABEs. I understand I may have brushed over that term a little bit earlier. So achieving best evidence video interviews. As part of the process, that's one of the few moments where you're sort of outside of the room, and there's that moment of confidentiality between survivor and the police themselves. What's the importance kind of behind that?
So the main reason we're not there is to effectively to maintain the independence element of our ISVA role. As ISVA, we only know the very kind of basics around a crime. So typically, who's responsible, how they were known, what the type of offence was, when it happened. We wouldn't know any kind of finer grained detail. Okay. The main reason for that, and the reason we kind of take that step back, is to effectively preserve our support, because essentially if the defence and obviously it does get to court, felt like we were somehow coaching that client because we knew the fine details, that could impact on the case. So because we know so little, and because we maintain that through being separate from the actual interview itself, we're present but we're not in the same room. It basically almost like proves that, so we're not wanting to be part of. You've not
prepped someone.
Exactly.
I think sort of one of the best ways I find to explain it is in the same way that witnesses can't talk to each other during a case because they can't be contaminating each other's evidence. We're going to be there throughout the whole process, and if we know the evidence, we're not going to be able to sit in that dock with someone who's reported to the police and is giving evidence, because it will look like we're coaching them,
passing words.
So and I think when I explain it like that, people do explain it. It sort of seems like one of the most incongruent elements, doesn't it, of the ISVA role, that someone's put their hand up and gone, okay, now I feel ready to speak out. And sometimes we have to go, we can't hear that much. And I think that does confuse people at the start. But there is a really good reason for that. And I think we're fortunate here because we do have other teams and other members of staff
who can serve roles as a confidant.
Yeah, exactly. So we can sort of protect our independence. And they still feel like they're in a space where they're able to speak up and able to talk out about their own experiences.
And it does sort of fit those wider purposes of connecting police with other services that are available, which they really, really do rely on. Over 70% of work done with survivors of domestic violence or of sexual harms is actually provided by charitable sectors and charitable support organisations like ourselves. And there's now that mandatory requirement that the police pass on information about available services in the area. There's an expectation now to create a plan of these services. That's still something that I know that some police organizations are still just kind of warming up to, but a lot of them are doing the signposting out there since 2024 when that kind of came into law.
Yeah, and that stat doesn't surprise me at all.
Yeah.
Because the work that some victim services and witness services do is brilliant.
Yeah.
But I do think survivors, I mean, safe space is a phrase that is used a lot, isn't it?
Yeah.
But having some separation from that process, feeling like you're talking to someone who is a little bit removed, I think people do look for that. And so I'm not surprised at all that 70% of the work sort of done with victims and witnesses is sort of through charitable organisations.
Yeah, no, 100%. And we'll talk a little bit towards the end about how our own organisation has played a role in supporting that kind of ABE process as well, and giving a little bit of that degree of separation also. I'm curious to talk more about that process leading up to court. So imagining a case that's been through its investigation stages, the next step would then be being picked up by the CPS, is that right?
Yes, effectively. I mean, it depends on police force area sometimes, because everyone works slightly differently. But essentially, the investigating officer would finish their investigation.
Yeah.
That would then go to their supervising officer, typically a sergeant, and then that would potentially go over to an inspector. And then I think in some areas they actually have almost like a diligence team to make sure it goes ahead. And if it hits their threshold, then they pass that then to CPS. I'd say it's probably not always that straightforward, because it can bounce back and forth between the CPS and police. It's a very normal part of the process.
Yeah, and that bouncing back, and we're talking about a threshold, is that about the level of evidence, or is it about its level of success, likelihood of conviction? What does that sort of stem on? Public interest?
So the CPS apply two sort of questions to every case that sort of lands on their desk, and that's, is there a realistic prospect of conviction?
Yeah.
And is it in the public interest to go ahead? Usually in this sort of work, it's in the public interest. But in terms of the CPS, their priority is with that court process. If two barristers are standing up, sort of thrashing this out, is there going to be a conviction at the end of it? So quite often they'll send things back to the police because they'll want to hear more from certain witnesses, or they'll want notes from certain services that haven't been spoken to
build
yet.
something more watertight.
Yeah, exactly. So it's completely normal. And I think it's a conversation I have an awful lot.
Yeah.
People go, it's back with the police, and it almost feels like a regression. It is a completely normal part of the process, and it's the CPS trying to make sure that their case is going to end in the outcome of a conviction. Yeah.
And when we're looking about the sort of duration of a case, the life cycle of a case, it's important recognizing as well, not just that 70% of the work is done in the community, but that if you have an independent sexual violence advisor or an independent domestic violence advisor, you're actually 50% more likely to, what they say, see out the process. So report all the way to court as being sort of an eventuality. I'm going to pull up some statistics from a recent study that sort of really explores the reasons why people have reported in the first place and what their priorities are in terms of survivors, not the CPS about prosecution or likelihood of conviction, but the actual slight differences about why survivors report themselves. Just a tiny little correction here. This is how you know we're a real podcast that goes back and fact checks itself. The operation I call Soteria here is Operation Soteria. And if you find that some of the findings within it may be a little skewed towards quite extreme responses, it's because it focuses on research involving male and female survivors of rape. So it's very specified to those kinds of instances. And of course, if you want to look at the information of the article and the operation itself, please check in the description. So looking more specifically at this study I've got for you here today, it was conducted by the University of City St. George's in London, by Hole, Pulleritz, Milso and Reed in 2024, and it's studying sort of Operation Soteria, which took place with the Avon and Somerset police, looking at the reasons from survivors themselves, this is men and women and others, about why they reported, what their hopes were, and for those who pulled out of the process or had the process be terminated, what the sort of reasons were behind that, and what they thought was really important. Something that's really crucial about this study is it's not just numbers. Too often I feel like survivors are reduced to data. There's a chance here for respondents to actually give their voices. I'm going to read out a couple of things from it as well about their experiences and what they wanted the police to know about their feelings on this matter. And the kind of conversations that you will have had with clients a lot in the past will really, really tie into this. So in terms of why people actually report in the first place, an overwhelming majority of survivors said that the outcome that was most important to them would be to stop the perpetrator. That's 88% of them. 75% of them wanted the perpetrator to know what they did was wrong. And in terms of the less extremely important reasons, we've got down at 56%. So it is a relevant reason for reporting. But for 56% of them, it was that they wanted to see the perpetrator convicted. Does that sort of fit your understanding of why survivors have told you that they've come forward and what their priorities are?
I think that would probably fit my experience in terms of that kind of
breakdown.
Yeah, the breakdown. I think the majority of people I've spoken to, it is about stopping that person hurting anybody else.
Yeah,
that seems to be a real motivating factor. What that actually looks like obviously does vary from individual to individual, because some of that would tie into the being convicted. But for some people, it's almost just the acknowledgement of that.
Yeah, or public opinion, or if it's a family matter, and which is much more likely for male survivors, much more likely to be a family perpetrator. Or actually, I think the comparison is 15% of male survivors compared to between 7 and 9% of female survivors experience abuse or harms from someone in a position of power. Yeah. So if it's about, even if there's not a conviction, the idea of a sort of trial of public opinion, knowledge and awareness, the people close to them might scrutinize, some details may come out, even if not all charges are successful. Yeah, so that kind of awareness sort of flows into it.
I think that's sort of teetering on the edge of the one thing that I was going to add as well, which is I think quite often people report because they've been doubted or not believed.
Yeah.
And they report just to see if there is an institution out there, if there's people out there who do believe them and will sort of have their corner. So I think that's one big reason that is sort of missed off the list, certainly in my personal experience.
Yeah.
But on the whole, I think there are so many reasons that we all engage with why people report. And I don't think that any one of them is better than another. The one thing I do think, though, is it needs to be your own reason. And that's something I do say to survivors a lot.
Yeah, I agree. I think we talk a lot in this kind of sphere and hear about, having the voice of the survivor being at the forefront. And that voice can say so many different things into, like you're saying, like that acknowledgement of, this has happened to me. I don't want it to happen to other people. I want someone to take responsibility for it, especially in cases where, for example, the perpetrator is deceased and it was done within an institution or something like that. So again, it's very important to kind of, it's sometimes quite difficult to break that down into what the actual individual survivor's voice is saying, not just as a whole.
Because I think sometimes, especially with that reason you gave at the start about ensuring that perpetrator is stopped, I think quite often a survivor can sort of be considering reporting to the police and have individuals around them going, "You have a duty to stop this person."
Yeah, I heard that one.
And I always struggle with it a little bit, because if that's what you want to do, if that's your choice, go for it, because you are in control of making that decision.
Yeah.
But as we've said, it can be a long process. There are moments that are difficult. We will try and make that as comfortable for that survivor as possible. But if it's someone has sort of shamed you into reporting, then it's going to be really difficult. Yeah. So that's what I mean when I say there's no right reason, but it's got to be your own reason, because it's got to sustain you.
It's got to sit with you for 5 years that this is worth seeing through.
The attrition rates are so high. And so, you shouldn't have to earn justice. But as I said, there are some really difficult moments. And if it's not your choice, you're being put in a position again where you're going to feel out of control. And our service is trying to do the opposite. It's trying to empower survivors to make choices that they are comfortable with, and make that an informed choice as well.
100%. Yeah, I think that's really, really crucial. So out of the 586 people in the study who didn't report to the police, the respondents who wrote back and gave their reasons why, the sort of overwhelming reason as to why they didn't go through with it was embarrassment or shame at 57%. I know these are common emotions for all survivors, but certainly for male survivors, it's something we struggle with. It can be questions about sexuality. It can also be some of the barriers caused by the greater likelihood for men that they have a familial perpetrator. It's pretty even for men, familial or acquaintance as being the perpetrator behind a crime. And with the acquaintance side of things, it can fall into fear of not being believed, which is at 44% in terms of worrying about the police won't believe them. Impact on loved ones at 42% of reasons why people didn't report. That can fall back into shame and embarrassment as well. So you get quite a picture of the reasons why people fall off this process. And also down at the bottom at 38%, we've got people who feared that they were partly to blame for what happened to them, the kind of myths that can affect survivors. That's something that you mentioned a little earlier when we spoke about the kind of support that we've got here. It's not just ISVAs. We have that support from therapists and community and those kind of confidants. Do you think that plays a role in helping break down the kind of myths?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think obviously it's really sad to hear those reasons why people choose not to report. But I do think tackling those is the big reason why our ISVA service has quite good attrition rates.
Yeah, so quite low, yeah.
Yeah, and people tend to sort of see the process through. And I think that's because we've got so many teams here that can all tackle those root causes. If you've met survivors in our safe room and you've sort of realised that it's nothing to be embarrassed about, there is no shame in that.
No.
If you've had therapy and you've realised that you aren't to blame, and you can sort of look back and be able to process those thoughts a little bit sort of better, a little bit more clearly. Yeah, I think you've tackled those root causes before you even report.
Yeah.
So I think we are really fortunate here that we've got a range of individuals who can all sort of provide that holistic wraparound care to survivors. Yeah,
no, absolutely. And now with the sort of the kind of launch of our supporter safe room, which really steps up the spaces available to supporters as well. You can imagine someone going through the reporting process, having a spouse or having, a family member there as a sort of a ride along and supporting them to support the survivor during that long period of time. And that is really, really, really crucial as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's something I'm really excited about, because quite often we do speak to partners, family members,
of course,
who are sort of wanting to ask their own questions about the process, and so that they're able to provide even more support to their sort of partner or family member. And I think supporters being more informed, having their own sort of network that they can lean on when times get tough, because it will at times. Yeah, I think is only going to be good for the survivors that are sort of choose to report and go through the process.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think there's definitely, with the barriers of shame and embarrassment, it feels like these sort of sexual offences, those who have, I don't like the word victim, but since we're talking about court, victims of those offences and those who end up as complainants in court bringing these cases forward, it can feel like they are on trial themselves, or that the sort of public treatment around them or perceptions around them. There's no other kind of crimes out there other than maybe fraud where people will look at someone and think about how they are to blame for what's happened to them. It feels like that standard of responsibility is stepped up, and survivors can often feel that, and bringing them into a space where we can challenge that immediately and say absolutely not. And it's not just survivors who'll see that, but the supporters around them, the services around them, and through your liaison, the police officers and CPS will be there to not see them as victims or not see them as complicit in what's gone on, but as someone who has a chance to really fight for justice and really, really be heard. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think it's part of the bigger picture as well, in terms of, kind of, we talk about communication and education and those kind of things. I think by offering support to both survivors and loved ones, we often talk about like a ripple effect with these kind of crimes. It obviously affects the survivor as an individual and really prolifically, but then their loved ones are also getting impacted, sometimes even wider society and communities. So the more we can kind of offer support, widen that net, so to speak, but still also giving that same quality of support for a survivor, I think that is going to go such a long way to combating those missing stereotypes, basically.
Yeah. When we look at the reasons why people actually pull out of this process voluntarily, so that's not situations where the police say the classic NFA, the no further action due to historical limitations of evidence or a number of factors. When we talk about people who voluntarily step out of the process, 47% of people said that the reason why they pulled out and what would have helped them continue was if they received more kindness and support from officers. 39% said access to a support worker. 35% said protection from the perpetrator, and 33%, and this is really crucial for us and for yourselves, is access to mental health support. And just behind that on 31% is more information about the process. So you can see where the ISVA role really, really slots into helping people find justice and stick through it. It seems like these kind of offences, these sexual offences, can sometimes put survivors in a position where they feel like they're on trial themselves. There can be judgment from the public, any other crimes like fraud. Are we in situations where people say, oh, how did you let that happen to you? So these myths really can play into it. And I feel like the wraparound nature of the service can absolutely challenge that. When you're looking at someone's fight for justice and being in the court and what it means to them, I think it's really, really important to have men like yourselves and the other ISVAs on the team there alongside them. I think that sort of final moment in court is really, really crucial as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think even with clients I've had and survivors that I've worked with where they have, maybe like a big loved one support network that go to court, I think even just having us there who've been through the journey where they can speak to us freely without not judgment, I don't mean that in a negative way, but more so, taking it home. They might not want to bother family. They might not want to kind of feel like they might feel like they're a burden. So having that kind of continuity for us and us present in court as well as family, for me, it's always about adding foundations to that person's journey. Yeah. And the more kind of solid foundations you've got, the more like that's to be stable. So again, going back to what you were saying before about the wraparound support, the raising awareness, all it can do is serve to just basically beat those missing stereotypes and give that wider kind of support net, if you will.
Yeah. Those things are so entrenched, aren't they? And as you say, it takes on average 20 years for someone to speak up. Yeah. They could have had all these myths and stereotypes and sort of feelings of shame and guilt reinforced. It takes a lot of people to sort of chip away at that and sort of show the survivor that's not true. That is a myth. That is a stereotype. Yeah. So having supporters involved, having us there as well, all sort of leads into that tackling those myths and stereotypes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that wider education of anyone involved in it, of course. Another small little addendum here. At the time in which we were recording this episode, our supporters services were all bundled under that rather unjazzy label of supporters safe room, etc. That's now known as the Nightingale safe room. And if you want any more up-to-date information about that service and our other services for supporters, please check our website. When we're talking about these kinds of myths and stereotypes, it's important to acknowledge that they don't obviously just affect survivors or maybe individuals involved in the process themselves, but actually that final kind of court process, that outcome, when we're looking at most sexual offences, they're of course at the level of the criminal court, so up from the magistrates. So we're dealing with a panel of jurors. How does that feel for the sort of survivors in that space in terms of the kind of support you've had to pull in for them, that they feel like they had their lives and their stories now kind of land with maybe 12 strangers and a judge?
I think it's so difficult because I think survivors throughout the process, they're looking for that day in court. I know that's the phrase we like to use. Yeah. And I think on the whole that despite whatever the outcome, they can feel that they've been heard. Yeah. But obviously it's so difficult, isn't it, that we will never know what was said in that jury room. Yeah. I think that's obviously one of the sort of key hallmarks of our legal system. But when it's you that's being discussed, I can only imagine how difficult it is to not know and to never be able to know what was said. So we do know the prevalence of those myths and stereotypes, and I can't help but feel that we do need to sort of address those in a way that is slightly more direct, doesn't use the sort of legalese and the jargon that you do hear in courtrooms, to ensure that jurors are going in with a sort of trauma-informed mindset.
I mean, I've come across it quite recently where there's been discussions around jurors getting like juror packs, which is like contain things like the evidence and things to review over in that way. And I know I've mentioned before about could those juror packs not include like almost like a myth buster? Because if it's factual, so like drawing on facts, figures, research, then I don't see any harm in that in terms of it's not influencing anyone's decision. It's actually saying, well, if your decision was based on this, that's a myth and a stereotype. And I think what we're hopefully relying on in court is the prosecutor or the judge themselves before the jury retire to decide the verdict, is there giving some guidance around myths and stereotypes.
Entirely.
So important.
And I think that judge summing up is really key. And because judges are getting better and better at tackling myths and stereotypes, I would say the big concern that I do have in that area is that summing up can take 45 minutes,
and
an hour and a half,
switch off, or
2 hours,
or made the decision preemptively.
And you only have to look at the jurors at approaching 4:00 on a Wednesday afternoon, and you've been listening to pretty graphic detail all day. That is not a succinct way of ensuring that jurors know that, well, we insert stereotype here, I suppose.
When we look at the kind of myths that can really, really cause damage about having jurors undermine evidence or misunderstand a lack of a certain factor in a case as being evidence that it didn't happen. Laura Flynn Hudspeth, who's a PhD researcher at the University of Huddersfield, wrote in sort of 2019, 2020 about these specific myths. They include things like thinking that most instances of rape would include an offence of strangulation. That's not our experiences, it's not survivors' experiences, or that they would cause some physical injury. These are things that are obvious to us when it comes to an understanding of natural reactions to experiences, the power of coercion, age differences, a number of different factors. But having that education take place at the end of a trial can be quite difficult because there's a lot of evidence that jurors can make up their minds very, very early. If a juror walked into the room with all that education and know-how, that's fantastic, but we've still got 11 of them that maybe don't. So are there suggestions? Have you paid attention to conversations about these juror trials that have been going on in Scotland at the moment, or suggestions that we could move away from a jury system? It's a bit of a hot topic.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always a little bit of I've always viewed it as a bit of a thought experiment. But I mean, there are so many suggestions of sort of either increasing the powers of magistrates, who are sort of party to all of that education, having professional jurors, lots of things like that. My own personal view, I'm increasingly beginning to see the benefits, I think, of professional jurors. But I don't think you can remove the principle of being before 12 of your peers who are judging you on sort of everyday logic and common sense. I think my first port of call would just be trying to increase the education in that area, making sure that jurors are, for want of a better word, qualified to be sitting on that panel and they aren't bringing in any prejudices. But again, it's difficult, isn't it? Because people do have sort of very entrenched and ingrained views on sexual violence and what a perpetrator looks like, and
that's
what
a classic
victim or
one.
Complainant looks like,
how they behave, and
how they should have behaved, who they should have told. So
I do see the arguments, but I do think there are a plethora of options that we have to explore that we haven't done yet before we have to resort to that sort of massive change in our justice system.
And I think maybe some of the drive around that is obviously because of how kind of bogged down maybe the justice system is at the minute for not just sexual kind of harm cases but other things as well. I think sometimes people are trying to find these kind of almost like shorter solutions to problems.
Yes.
I think one of the big things I'm kind of, from against my personal viewpoint, but also based on my experience, is that yes, it'd be absolutely amazing to raise the awareness and knowledge and beat myths and stereotypes for jurors, which are effectively members of the public. I think a lot of professionals could also benefit from that, but I think for me, it's a much bigger, wider issue. I think we as a society need to be talking about this more often, because I think that ultimately is what influences the jurors to have those viewpoints. And if we tackled it at a society level, and I'm not saying that's an easy fix because I know it's not, I think we'd see less of that mindset, because ultimately, if you're looking at it from a it's got to be proven beyond reasonable doubt. If you put it into just experts, there's a slight, not a skewing necessarily, but I guess there'd be pushback on that.
I think
in some respect,
there's certainly an element of becoming sort of callous and sort of hardened by the issues. And if you're in the legal profession and you're listening to these details day in, day out,
Yes.
It sort of defeats the point to have those people judging or at least passing verdicts on suspects and on defendants. There's an element that it is that sort of ignorance to an extent that makes a jury what it is, but they do need to be better informed. I do also hear the arguments that if we were to get rid of juries or to have professional jurors, that there would probably be less delays. I imagine there'd be costs saved because of expenses and bringing people in from everywhere.
Yeah.
But still, I do think it is sort of a tenet of our legal system, and one that is still very valuable.
It's always crucial to be wary about when costs come into conversations about justice. I don't mind talking about my own voluntary background as a magistrate myself. I have seen the limitations, definitely, of the magistrate system. I think the benefit is, if I've ever been in a kind of retiring room and I've been making a decision, I always have the power to kind of pull my colleagues aside and remind them of training or recommend them for further training. I can't just lob a juror out a window and say, you're a wrong and you've got this one. There's more checks and balances in place. I think the system would benefit more if there were more magistrates from a wider degree of backgrounds, greater walks of life. I think it... because of the voluntary requirement of it, I think it naturally targets people from certain maybe more affluent backgrounds, or maybe from maybe who are retired. Some greater diversity as well when it comes to the language skills required. They're often English speaking, which the way someone's able to communicate in court is really important about how they're received. And there are wider cultural myths that we've explored in earlier episodes of this podcast about why people keep silent as well. I think that increasing magistrate powers probably isn't immediately the answer, because there's a huge backlog and we don't want to rush justice. I think that's really important.
I completely agree. And I think the key thing you said there to me is about the age.
Yes.
Obviously, I know you do some magistrate work,
Sure.
but a lot of people do who are almost as a bit of a retirement plan.
Yeah, that's fair.
And the breadth of experience that we see in survivors needs to be judged by a breadth of experience of juror or someone who is going to make that decision.
Yeah.
How often do we see a young person who's in an open relationship or something that in previous generations people just wouldn't have experienced or understood?
Yeah.
There are so many different sort of elements of a survivor's experience, and each of those need to be at least voiced inside a courtroom.
There's no magistrate training on chemsex.
Yeah, and I would be very nervous about one sort of demographic of people judging everyone.
Yeah, no, that's completely understandable. Yeah. And I think something that I would like to see on my own side of things as well is a little bit more pushback when it comes to the use of myths and stereotypes from defense lawyers or from, I don't know if you've seen this on the Crown level, but on the magistrates level, I'm unfortunately find myself sometimes people attempt to mislead me about what the burden of proof is and the standard of certainty for cases. And that can be really, really difficult as well for the survivor to hear if I'm sitting in the court and hearing someone say, if there's even a grain of anything in your mind at all, or there's a potential that, someone could have walked into the room or a bird could have done it with a knife that's strapped to its wing, then let the guy go. There's levels and levels and levels of, there are standards for a reason and the tests are really important, but let's not pretend that, let's not invite uncertainty in.
It's why a jury has to be sure now, rather than beyond a reasonable doubt.
Which I really love.
I think the one thing I would say, I'm all for that change.
Yeah.
Because beyond a reasonable doubt does seem like an impossibly high standard.
Yes.
But I would say that I know the direction at the moment is that sure is an everyday word. You know what sure means.
Yeah.
I think when you're in that really impressive environment of a courtroom, people do overthink, I think, what sure means.
Yeah.
And people sort of doubt whether they're sure of anything. And it can get all existential very quickly. I think there needs to be a better direction around the word sure.
Yeah.
I don't think I am of the sort of intellectual capacity to say what the direction should be. But I do think there needs to be a bit of clarity. I'm all for the word sure.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think.
But you want to be sure that people know what sure means.
Yeah, no, yeah.
Completely understandable.
It's anything to demystify that process for me, because I think anything to do with the legal system, it's inherently based in a different language to everyday English.
Yeah.
And I think that can be really kind of disconcerting for, I remember my first time in court, not in this role, and actually in a jury role. And it was like my eyes had just been opened. I'd watched films, but nothing kind of prepared me for that experience.
Yeah.
And I can obviously reflect on that now, doing what I'm doing. But I think, like you said, saying sure instead of beyond a reasonable doubt, it's less of a mouthful. It's just making sure that
there you go.
There you go. But it is just, is everyone of that same understanding?
Yeah.
And that's what's important. And is everyone understanding what's going on? That's a key tenet, I think.
And just to address what you said before about defence barristers maybe playing up to that confusion.
In prosecution, I've seen do this as well.
Yeah.
I have to be a lot more impartial. I can't be rooting for any side.
Yeah, of course.
But just in terms of the relevance for your role and for the guys listening, I'm talking about defence. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think I'm a strong believer in innocent until proven guilty.
Of course.
We all are here.
Yeah.
And I'm sure we wouldn't have it any other way. But that surely there's got to be some middle ground of playing cards that we know play up to myths and stereotypes.
Yeah.
That we know don't hold any sort of real value in the studies that have been done on typical responses in survivors. So I do think we need, well, it goes back to that education, doesn't it? We need people to be informed before they make these choices.
100%.
That's survivors, that's barristers, that's jurors. It's all going back to that sort of theme of education, isn't it?
Gentlemen, thank you so much for answering all my questions and curiosities. Really, really appreciate you both taking the time to talk to me today. I've just got one last little thing I want to ask you about. Now, normally here is where we do an activity spotlight. We talk about one of our services that's available. I suppose a service spotlight is more appropriate in terms of what I want to call this little segment today, because I really want to talk about this space that we are actually in right now, very conveniently, which is our Nightingale suite here at the centre, and about its role as a space for those ABEs, the video interviews, and its place as a kind of a sanctity for survivors themselves. So who wants to tell me a little bit about the Nightingale and its new and increased role?
I'm very happy to start off. So I'm so passionate about our Nightingale suite. I think, as I said, the video interview can be one of the most...
It's daunting.
...intense parts of the process. It's when you've just broken your silence and now you're talking about it in details that's a lot more graphic, perhaps, than Duncan or I will be able to hear. Mm-hmm. So the Nightingale suite is where we can conduct video interviews in what has become that survivor's safe space.
Yes.
So survivors could have been engaged in our service for weeks, months, years, decided they wanted to report to the police, and we've got this room available, which means they don't have to go to a police station. They sit in a comfortable chair in a space that they're familiar with, and they're able to talk about that detail in a place that they've done that before.
Yeah.
They don't have to deal with the stress of finding the police station, sitting in the room in front of two strangers.
Right, yeah.
So it's something we're really passionate about. And I think it's something that police forces are becoming increasingly sort of happy to do.
Yeah.
Because we're seeing the benefits. We're seeing people achieve their best evidence.
There we
That's
go.
what we set out to do.
Yeah, no, fantastic. And so in terms of the Nightingale's kind of increased role in this process, is this now like a recognised space for police to conduct interviews? Is that my understanding?
So in terms of things like the police booking it for themselves, we are currently looking at we get a Nightingale coordinator. So
Yeah.
help kind of book that space out. Not so much independently of us. So, like for example, if the police are dealing with a survivor that doesn't have necessarily an ISVA, we'd ideally always want to be part of that kind of process,
course,
or at least
yeah.
make sure they've got that as an offer. But yeah, there's got to be kind of a wider net, I guess, in terms of its availability, and we're trying to kind of spread that word now that it can be used.
It's made it more official. So this is about a step away
Yeah.
from the old school of thought with you've got to be there with the coppers in the station. So it's about that change in culture, right?
And just for clarity as well, at the moment, we use all of the sort of Greater Manchester Police equipment and everything. So
Yeah.
it is very official. It's not this room and we're recording it on our iPhone. Everything is sort of
so-
registered with the police force.
So there's no concern for the survivor that it's not as formal or they're not being taken seriously.
Yeah,
or
they won't be penalised in any way for using our room rather than going to a police suite.
It's essentially a difference of space as opposed to a difference of process. So
Yeah.
because they're using police equipment, they can do mobile equipment interviews anyway.
Yeah.
In other places. So essentially, all that's really kind of changing in that manner from not an official point of view, but
Yeah.
from kind of a space point of view, is that they're here.
Yeah.
And we've got really good links in with the kind of Nightingale team in Greater Manchester Police. They've come in, they've approved it all, they're really happy with it.
Yeah.
There are going to be other Nightingale suites elsewhere in Greater Manchester, but for us, this has been kind of a culmination of not pushing it necessarily, but kind of say, look, what can we do for survivors to give them more options and more availability to kind of achieve their best evidence.
Yeah, it fits into that idea of empowering survivors,
100%.
giving them choices, but also feeding back from those professional organisations that have done the bulk of the support work for survivors, making it stand in official process and be recognised that the things and the lessons you've learnt about what survivors need are now something that the police themselves will recognise. To kind of close our conversations off today, I mentioned earlier that I wanted to pull something from one of the survivors' voices in the Operation Soteria report itself, and I think that's really, really important. So I wanted to share some of the feedback about why someone had not been able to complete the process, and kind of lead into some closing thoughts on what you think we can change as a wider organisation or as a wider society. I know we've danced on it today, but about one thing that you think would be really, really important as a message going forward. For members of the police, maybe members of the justice system, or individuals involved in the process in general, about what you would change if we elected you immediately with an overwhelming majority. And this survivor spoke specifically on reasons why they didn't talk, as I said. I froze in response to rape, assault, and trauma. Being so dissociated, I wasn't able to go through reporting to the police. I wasn't going to be put through the experience of reporting, rape kit, having to explain and not be believed, to undergo cross-examination by a defense lawyer, scrutiny of my clothes, sexual history, and of course the low rate of convictions in these sexual assault and rape prosecutions. So that's why, and it's important the police know why. So in light of that, and in the light of that survivor's words, what would you change about our current process to try and create a world in which more people can report and be heard and ultimately be believed?
Duncan, do you want to go first?
Oh,
Rock, paper, scissors?
yeah, maybe. I mean, I'm backtracking a tiny bit here, but I think again, it's that wider education awareness. Maybe an attitude is maybe a way of doing it. To these kind of offences from everybody.
Yeah.
Everyone affected by, influenced by, or even just part of the world that we're in. I think that person that what that survivor said, it echoes a lot of what we've talked about in terms of the barriers, the things like not being believed, it'll be exploring where's that kind of come from. And that's what we try and be doing through like an assessment process, and just general conversation, get that what's happened so far, have you made a disclosure to anybody and what's happened with that? Because by exploring that will help us understand a bit more around why they feel like that is such a barrier.
Yeah.
And not to push them through that barrier, but
No.
if you have an understanding, we can give them options then.
100%. Yeah. What about yourself, Kaelin?
I think if I were elected with an overwhelming majority tomorrow, I would have almost a mandatory ISVA at the moment of report to sexual harms.
Yeah.
So I'd almost have an opt-out.
Right, so it's an assumed...
Yeah, because I think we do see lower attrition rates when someone has an ISVA.
Of course.
They're able to start that process with a bit of clarity, with support. And if they don't want it, that is entirely their choice and there'd be no pressure.
Yeah.
But at least then someone could explain what an ISVA is to them. They can know that support is there for them if they did want it.
Yeah.
So I think that's what I would do. And the sort of message that I would send as part of that is, I think we should be working together more. Yeah. Currently, there's ISVAs, there's the police, there's the CPS, there's the barrister on the day. I think we should not be viewing each other as sort of enemies or that we have different motivations, because we all do want the same thing.
Yeah.
If there was that mandatory ISVA, I do think it would encourage a bit of trust between all of our services, because we all do just want the best outcome for that survivor.
Yeah, I agree. And just to very briefly expand on that, I think it's about maybe like the early opt-in model, but also I'm a firm believer in effective kind of onward referral. So actually explaining what that role is a little bit, not in the extent that we would, but at least so someone has a real understanding of this is what they can do to help you. I think that's not always done, and it's almost done as a passing, like, oh, I've done this.
Yeah.
And I think as a whole, and this includes us, we just need to be more effective at that communication between us so we're all talking from the same page.
100%, yeah, and avoid the feelings survivors can get where they feel like they're maybe passed between services or institutional distrust. If throughout the process they are involved in it, because we know the language of justice, we know how inaccessible it is. If it's plainly explained why it's in their interests, and they're given that choice at that point, but it's always assumed that you are going to be there and that you are going to support them, because for someone coming into the process, having a kind of expert who is outside of it, you're sort of like the genie in the lamp. You show up and say, hey kids, seems like you need to report to the police. Here's what it looks like. And having that going through that with them all the way, I think is really nice. It's you're sort of you're a guide to their expectations, but you are facilitating contact through which their journey is going to be as smooth as possible.
Yeah, the sort of almost one piece of continuity throughout what is a very up and down
chaotic
process.
time. Yeah.
Yeah.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a real pleasure having you here. It's been fantastic to talk about justice, something I am unfortunately very, very passionate about, and understanding and better appreciating your role in helping survivors go through that process and get the justice that they determine is most important to themselves. And that's what has been a really, really crucial through thread all about today, about supporting them to get that outcome that they deserve. Now, as we close, remember that you, of course, have been listening to the Beyond the Silence podcast. The best way to get involved, send in any letters, any feedback, suggestions of research or news topics that you would like us to discuss in future episodes is via our social media at This Is Survivors. You can also look in the description of this episode and see the 2 articles that I've discussed today. Beyond that, you can also email us in via support@wearesurvivors.org.uk. And you can find out more information if you are a survivor yourself, or if you know a survivor, or as we've discussed today, support a survivor on our website about how to refer in and start to receive that support. Now, gentlemen, if I could ask you one more question, if I may be so bold, what would be your final messages to any survivors listening today?
I'll go first. I think if there's any part of you considering reporting, just come and have a chat with us. There's absolutely no pressure. We can see sort of if the process is going to be right for you. We can offer you some support. And if it's not, then absolutely no problem at all. But at least you've had that conversation and we can inform that choice as well as we can.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
And I'd just say, you're not alone with this. We can really help you with this journey. You don't have to be on your own about it anymore. And we're not here to put you under any pressure. Just come and have a chat with us.
and go from there.
Yeah.
Guys, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for
Thank
having
you.
us.
Thank
And finally, from our safe space to yours, goodbye.